You're listening to Your Rivers Are Wrong, the podcast.
Good morning, or evening, or afternoon, whenever you may be. Welcome back to the Your Rivers Are Wrong podcast. We're here as we are every week to talk about the wonderful whimsies of world building, the arts and aesthetics of setting up a setting, and telling stories born from it. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dante, and today I have a very special guest joining me for a very special episode, and I'm so excited. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to make it through this script. You might know her from her published works, including but not limited to What Crooked Roots, Clean Spirit, Tangled Blessings, the recently nominated Indie Groundbreaker Awards Most Innovative, The Sticker Game, and also most recently announced Carved by the Garden. I'm very happy to welcome Cassi Mothwin to the podcast.
Oh my God.
Everybody welcome.
Thank you so much. I've never had all of my titles read to me like that. That was quite nice. We can do it again if you want. No, I'm just kidding.
You do a take two of that? Do a take two? No. Honestly, there's so much I could have added to that. And I was like, what of your recent accomplishments can I add to this intro? And there's just so many.
There's so many.
I feel like every week I log onto Twitter and it's like, oh, Cassie's doing something else this week. Oh, she's working with this person this week. And it's just so exciting to see.
I'm taking the next 4 months off though, so it'll balance out.
Fantastic. That's so good. I'm so happy for you. Could you just do your own introduction for yourself?
Sure. So I am Cassi Mothwin. I am a tabletop RPG designer. I also do a little bit of streaming on the side and illustrating. All of this is actually on the side. This is not my full-time thing. I just really like it, so I'm just really busy with it. I got my start working on some folk horror supplements for Dungeons and Dragons, and then I left folk horror, and now I'm back writing a solo game that revolves all around folk horror. So I just really love spooky things.
Yeah, that's definitely the vibe I caught. I don't know if you've seen any of the previous episodes, but in this last season, season 5, which is like the last 10 episodes, the first 5 of them, my co-host Merle and I bring up Tangled Blessings in the first 5 minutes of every single one of those episodes because we're fresh off of playing one of our sessions. We got all of those prompts directly in our mind, and there's nothing else more exciting in that week to talk about than what just happened in that game.
I'm so honored. I just love that you guys played it. I'm so proud of Tangled Blessings, and I'm so excited because the rest of the year after Carved by the Garden, which is the folk horror game I'm kickstarting right now, after that comes out, I'm going to work on getting all the expansions out for Tangled Blessings. So hopefully there's a little bit more content to interact with. But I'm very excited. I'm so happy with the reception of Tangled Blessings.
We are too. We are also excited. I remember seeing on the cover, it's like, 2 to 4 hour session. And then we're 20 hours deep. That was a lie.
Listen, what you do with the game is up to you. I'm just saying, at least 2 to 4 hours. You got your money's worth, though.
Oh, absolutely. There is something about, and obviously we're going to talk about other things, especially the topic of this episode, but on Tangled Blessings, it was like the game of role-playing distilled down to its purest form. For two people who are very much used to the structure of games like Dungeons and Dragons and the stats and the numbers of all that, to strip all of that away and just let two people who love writing stories just write a story. Oh my gosh. It was like, I didn't know that games could be played that way. And it caught me off guard so much. So thank you so much for writing.
You're welcome. Yeah, so that's definitely one thing I want to explore in the future is I've had several people approach me and say, from a duet perspective, this was really fun. Same thing for solo. People tell me it's a fun solo game, but it was designed from a system that was primarily solo driven. So to hear that, hey, this worked really well as a duet game, make more of this, it's really cool. And I love hearing that it worked out and that it flowed so well, because that was something I was insecure about, that it doesn't have a character sheet or stats or dice rolling or anything like that. And I was nervous that players would find it lacking because it was missing those things. So I'm really glad you vibed with it.
Thank you. You can rest assured that immediately after we finished, I went straight to itch and I was like, duet into the search bar. I'm like, there's got to be games like this out there somewhere. I know, it was just a fantastic experience. So again, thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks for helping me spread the word about it while we were crowdfunding. Really appreciate it.
Of course. So for these episodes, I want to say this is coming out before season 6, which is a weird jumble because we've already recorded some of those episodes. And since I'm disappearing from the US for a couple of weeks, it's just all going to be some blob that I release eventually. But for these episodes, typically, we tackle a singular prompt related to world building and storytelling and kind of break down the nuances of what makes it so special and how it changes the form and the structure of storytelling in its own right. And that could be as simple as an inspiration from another series or a wide scoping motif or something as small or as brilliant as like, I don't know, dinosaurs or robots or like just little ideas that inspire whole branches of different ways to tell the story. So today, I discussed this with you before the podcast, what we wanted to talk about today, and we settled on folk horror. Now, I heard the phrase folk horror, and I didn't know what it meant. I'm gonna be totally honest, and I'm exposing myself here. I'm like, horror, sure. Folk horror, yeah, whatever that is, that works too. You know.
I will tell you, and I know you still have more to the story, but I want to tell you that so many people approach me and tell me they don't know what folk horror means. So you're not alone, and you're not the first person to tell me that you don't know what it is. So no worries.
Okay, I'm glad because I felt like I was entirely out of the loop, and I had an impression of what folk horror is, and I figure I should probably ask you to define it for people listening who are like me and have no idea what exactly that definition fits. But in my head, right? And this is where I say something wrong and you correct me, right?
That's the best way to learn though, right?
Exactly. So I believed that it was like folklore, you know, like vampires and werewolves and stuff like that. And then horror, which is like scary things. So I'm just like, oh, it's the genre of like magical beasts and cryptids and stuff like that. And like the manifestation of monsters, so to speak. That was my initial impression of what folk horror is. And the internet has corrected me, but I want to defer to you to properly explain or define just what folk horror is in essence.
Sure. I do want to say that I don't think you're completely off. I think there's like two definitions of folk horror that sort of float around, and some people get stuck on this sort of British notion of folk horror, and that's what emerged in the 60s with several films. You'll see the popular films are The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, and Witchfinder General are sort of these like initial folk horror films. And I can talk a little bit more about their themes if we're interested later.
Sure.
And so people will say that things that that contain those themes and sort of capture the essence of those films are folk horror, and that other items that speak to monsters and creatures and that type of thing aren't. But I would disagree. The world is wide and vast and broad, and we have folklore and folk stories throughout the world. So I wouldn't say that you're wrong if you say cryptids are part of folk horror. I definitely think they are. And what I mean by that is I think folk horror is primarily a genre that is focused on storytelling, and I think it's a word of mouth horror. So most of, I know that sounds really loaded, but most of the stories and folk horror themes that you'll hear are things that have been passed down, stories that have been passed down, legends that have been passed down, or rules that have been passed down. And if you break those rules, if you cross those legends, if you do the wrong thing, that's when the horror starts. And so to put it succinctly, and there's not really a nice bow you can put on folk horror, it's not listening to the rules and going against them and being punished. And you'll see that, I think, in a lot more modern films and a lot more modern folk horror tales. You'll see there's sort of this departure from the 70s and 60s folk horror staples. So I don't think you're wrong. I think you're right. I think people sort of argue a little bit about what it is, but I've done a lot of research on it and done a lot of writing on it. And I think it's just a very sort of fluid term and genre, but mostly it's usually the landscape is part of the genre almost always. It's almost as if the landscape is a creature. There's almost always violence. There is almost always some supernatural element, and there's almost always weird people doing weird stuff.
That's totally fair. What stuck out to me was setting when you were describing like things key or integral to folk horror, because I feel like whenever I look towards examples of folk horror, it's very specifically placed in a place that almost feels, what's the word I'm looking for? Like trapping, kind of. It's almost like an enclosed space where these traditions or these very old beliefs are held very strongly or very powerfully. And it feels like it's sealed away from the wider world and its own little microcosm in itself.
Yes.
So when you say like the setting is so important, I'm like, yes, it's something unlike anywhere else.
Yeah,
You are the vibe.
You're 100% correct. Like I was saying, the setting and the land are usually like essentially a character of folk horror tales. Even if it's an island or if it's the woods or if it's a prairie, it's this setting will isolate and separate the visitors or the quote unquote outsiders usually from normal quote unquote civilization where then they will be captured. And I use that as a loose term, not necessarily meaning they'll be imprisoned, but they'll not be able to leave. There's no escape from this locked in syndrome, so to speak. Either you're surrounded by trees or you're surrounded by wheat or you're surrounded by water and there's nowhere to go. You either need to assimilate or you will not survive.
Yeah, totally fair. Do you mind if I ask what led you towards these types of stories like in the first place? Because I realize when I'm learning about other authors and game designers, they kind of gravitate towards certain genres or certain themes or settings that they really enjoy. I guess the question is, what brought you to this space or this genre, and why do you perhaps just resonate so strongly with it?
So when I was a child, I wanted so badly to be something that wasn't human.
Okay, wait, that's relatable.
I wanted so badly to be a member of the Fae or a fairy person. And I lived at the end, and I talk about this a little bit at the end of Carved by the Garden. I lived at the end of this dead-end road, and it was completely surrounded by miles and miles of trees that very few people had explored. Now, some of the locals, they would dump things in these woods, so I would find just piles of abandoned items, like piles of broken televisions, piles of stuffed animals that have been discarded, like just dumped out of a truck, and then the truck drove away. And my neighbors would sometimes see me in these woods because I would walk them alone. And I would wear like a Halloween costume while I was walking around the woods. I just wanted so badly to be like the scary witch lady when I was 12. And I think I still do.
Listen, you're totally valid. That is completely understandable.
I'm just living my dreams in a different way, okay?
I just love the idea of your neighbor just walking into the forest, trying to dump something, I guess, and just finding this little girl in this weird costume, just huddled next to a couple of things, hidden away in the corner.
I have this vivid memory of me in this vampire costume, and like this tree had fallen over and I had walked up it, and I'm standing at the top of this tree looking down at someone, and I'm like, whoa. In my head, I look so cool, but... That's
nightmarish. Oh my gosh.
I was a weird kid, and I never grew out of it, is really what's happening.
Okay, that wasn't when I asked you what led you towards this genre. That's not what I expected to hear. But yeah, it kind of explains a lot.
Yeah, I know. I don't really have like a good, smart answer. I kind of do. Like, the one of them is like, I think there's a really interesting power struggle that happens with folk horror that doesn't necessarily happen in other genres. And I could spew about that a little bit and sound really intelligent. But at the heart of it, I'm just a wild child, okay?
I think that's totally valid. Wow. Yeah. Talk about your upbringing really defining. I mean, listen, I hear where you're coming from. I wanted to be a witch when you're growing up. I felt the same way, which wasn't as a witch, but more when I was a kid, I very much wanted to like be a dragon.
Yeah.
That was just kind of, I don't know if you've gotten that vibe from everything I published.
I think I kind of put it together.
Okay, cool. But obviously it never happened. But I always leaned towards these high fantasy settings, these wondrous worlds. I always wanted to be like apart from anything like realistic. And it was, getting lost in those books and that fiction was always such a joy to me, which translates really well into running games or helping we found our place worlds.
We did what we could.
Yeah, we got there with what we had, I suppose. But yeah, that's so cool. Can I ask you, I guess, then, is there anything in particular, maybe either growing up, not just growing up, but like now that you're actually writing things, is there any piece of media that you pull from in particular or favor or really lean into that help direct like what kind of things you make today?
Oh,
you have like big influences in that,
sure. Space. I do have ADHD, which means that it's hard for me to remember things that I find really inspirational or incredible works of art, and I don't really hang out in one genre very often outside of folk horror and horror in general. I just really like horror because of that, and it's something I've just had to come to terms with. I'm just not someone who's going to be like, these are my top 3 favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, sure.
But I will say I do tend to gravitate towards anything horror, whether that is like a book or copy pasta on the internet or weird comics or film. I really enjoy horror, and I really enjoy seeing people break the boundaries in horror. And I think I just pull inspiration for horror from everywhere as well. When you say horror so many times in a row, it just starts to sound like a non-word. But I mean, even I'm playing The Legend of Zelda right now. Like in some way, shape, or form that's going to creep into whatever I work on. Of
course.
It's just the nature of the beast. I think as a creative, it's so hard for me to isolate anything. I'm just downloading everything constantly.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, you went from the dark academia kind of space, and then went back into I'm assuming what is going to be more rooted into nature in terms of Carved by the Garden.
Rooted. There it is. Yeah.
What do you call it? You had just saw this tweet, and it's just like you chose a specific font because it was related to like a city or urbanist space, and it was slowly being reclaimed by the art of the plants around it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, your mind. No, I'm kidding. But like just the idea of embodying this kind of contrast between a modern cityscape, or what people are very much accustomed to something more ancient, something older, something more rooted in nature. Just the dichotomy of those two meeting.
What you are describing is the thesis of folk horror. It is to circle back just a little bit. It's this discussion that the city folk, they have left the wilderness, they have left the natural world, and going back and trying to figure out how to relive in the woods. That was a huge anxiety during the times of the 60s and 70s when sort of folk horror, I'm putting it in quotes, you can't see me, rose to popularity. And people didn't call it folk horror then. I'm pretty sure it's like a term we put on it later as we started studying the genre. But at its core, it's this anxiety of, we have been away from the woods for so long. We don't know the rules anymore. We don't know the creatures that inhabit that space and how to coexist with them like we did in the 1800s, like we did years and years ago. So if we leave the city and we have to for survival, what do we do? How do we overcome that? So there you go. You know what folk horror is.
Yeah. And then reckoning with what has already existed in that space prior.
Yes.
Yeah. It's terrifying. And there's something... And with all the technology, with all the advances of everything that we have, with GPSs and radars and all that stuff, there's very little creepier than walking into the woods at night.
I think it's even creepy to walk in the woods during the day.
That's fair too. Maybe I'm too used to the city life, getting too close to just anywhere with like no roads, no promise that it's going to be safe. Terrifying. Well, with this podcast, we do talk about world building and how the approach to that is changed by these motifs or these themes. When you work to create a setting within the realm of folk horror, are there any like tenets or foundations you kind of cling to or work from, like something you build out of when coming up with something like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I kind of touched on them a little bit earlier when I was describing the characteristics of folk horror. And I mean, I think the bullet points work here as well. There's almost always weird people doing weird things. It's isolated from normal police. I'm putting it in quotes, finger quotes over here, normal police societies. So the realm of morality is going to be different in this location compared to everywhere else. There's going to be a supernatural element of some sort, whether that is a giant beast that will eat the people or that's some spooky ghost that haunts them. There's got to be a supernatural element. That's just a very strong mark of folk horror. And then there is, of course, the isolation aspect where there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to go, and if you want to survive there, you're going to have to follow the rules. And I think that's the big tenet is there are rules, and the people who are coming from the outside do not get to know those rules.
Oh, is the discovery of these rules part of the process?
Yes.
Oh, I guess it would be, right.
And that's just my personal opinion. That's not really like coded anywhere, right? But when it comes to writing a story, are reading folk stories, that's the big piece. And that's why it's so scary, because there are rules that you don't know. And if you don't follow them, something bad will happen.
Yeah, and trying to figure out those rules before you are punished for breaking them.
And you might not even know there are rules yet that you're breaking. The only way you learn is other people are breaking them. And that's a common trope in almost all modern folk horror media. And just off the top of my head, The Ritual, Midsummer, and The Witch.
I think what I'm gravitating towards in terms of like what really sets this genre apart is like this creeping hopelessness, where it's the realization that this is no longer a situation you can escape from.
Right.
This is no longer something you can ignore or pretend doesn't exist or just overcome with what you know. It's kind of an adapt or die sort of energy.
And one of the things I talk about in What Crooked Roots in my folk horror section is this sense of it will happen again. So it's not even just this hopelessness of this is happening. It's this is happening and I can't stop it. And then it's going to continue to happen and get worse for other people or worse for me in the future. I think a big thing in folk horror is this like cycle, which goes back to nature and the cycle of nature. I think nature and folk horror are very intertwined. That's not necessarily a belief everyone has, but in all of my readings, I am pretty sure they're very related.
Yeah, I think that's a tenet in a lot of horror where it's like when the main character realizes this story isn't about them. You know, they're just another person, another name in something that's been happening over and over and over again. Whereas the main character, almost the main character is the setting and how things are processed through the setting. And once you just become another face in a story that will repeat over and over and over again, you realize the gravity of how terrifying the situation is.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, and I'm going to open up to you. I feel like this is something that I have to admit. I grew up and still I'm not a horror movie watcher. There's times when I look at the plot of a story and the twists and turns that I expect will happen, and I'll be like, you know what? Maybe my mind will be more peaceful if I just never watch this movie. Why take the risk? You know? And I've missed out on a lot of movies that way. I've missed out on a lot of pop culture. They're tenets of cinema, so to speak.
It makes sense that you didn't know what folk horror was then, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's totally fine. Horror, I mean, instead of jumping out of an airplane, I watch horror movies, you know. I guess helicopters, but people jump out of helicopters. Instead of doing that, I watch horror movies.
And that's totally valid. Absolutely. Is there anything you would recommend to somebody who's interested in folk horror but doesn't know exactly where to jump in on something like that?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I would recommend Damnable Tales, a folk horror anthology by Richard Wells. Richard Wells is sort of the folk horror artist. So if you've ever seen if you Google folk horror art, almost all the art that pops up is likely going to be Richard Wells. And he put together a collection in 2022 of a lot of folk horror stories dating all the way back to the before times. So I'm talking like the 1800s, like so before like films and such, before we even knew what folk horror was. And I have the collection, and it's a great collection. There are some great stories in there. And if you can't afford it, a lot of them are just free online. So if you Google the table of contents, you can just like search the story, because a lot of them are out of copyright. So you can just find them that way.
Oh, amazing.
But it's his art in it. He has art for each story, like a companion piece. And it's a really great book. It's very well put together.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I'm on Google right now, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I get the vibe. I see it. I can see it.
There was a documentary too. So there was a documentary that came out in 2021, and I did watch it before I wrote What Crooked Roots, and it's called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. And it is a great documentary. I think it was about 3 hours long. But it goes through sort of the history of folk horror and the morphism it's kind of gone through, and how the definition has grown to include films and work in media from around the world. So if you have the ability to watch it, it's a great film. It's a great flick. It contains a lot of the scenes from horror movies that you might not want to watch, but you want to get a better understanding of. And that's why it's so long. But if you want a really good introduction to folk horror, but you don't feel like reading, And you can sit down for a 3-hour movie. Highly recommend it.
Sure. I mean, listen, I've got a 6-hour flight ahead of me. So, I mean, listen, if I need time, I've got the time. I don't know if I want to land in another country spooked. I don't know if that's what I'm looking forward to. But yeah, thank you. I'll remember that and I'll check that out. Okay. So, I mean, listen, that was all my bullet points. From here on out, we could just jump to the prompt and see where that takes us. How's that sound?
Sure.
Okay. So for people unfamiliar with the process of the prompt, one host tosses to the other host a simple, usually 1-2 sentence prompt that they improvise on the spot. They've never heard this prompt before, and they're just going to whip up whatever story comes to their mind. Cassie, I have one for you. Would you do the honors in tackling it for me?
I will. I'm nervous and excited.
I feel like I'm going to throw a real softball here.
Oh, gosh.
I had an idea and then I scrapped it because I heard of your of your history, and I'm just going to give you something that should hopefully feel right at home. Are you ready?
Okay.
Okay. Real simple. This story will be told through the eyes of a sheriff arriving at a town just on the edge of the woods, looking for a girl that was lost in it.
Okay. So a sheriff, automatically, everyone is like, who invited this guy, right? They're handling the search just fine. They've organized. They have flashlights and what you need to search the woods. They don't need this outsider to join in. But I think as the sheriff sort of explores this town and tries to track down the suspects, who I should say are very strange. You've got the grocery store lady is going to be a suspect because the little girl used to stop in here every day and get a candy bar, and she didn't come in, but
of course,
supposedly passersby saw the little girl come in this grocery store before she disappeared. So that's strange. And then, of course, the teacher, the little girl's teacher, was supposed to walk her home today and didn't. So that's very interesting. And it's these people that the parents trusted implicitly with their little girl. They find it so strange that she was just left on her own. So the sheriff, and I'm gonna give him he, him pronouns.
Sure.
The sheriff is concerned why the parents would trust the school teacher and trust the grocery store person. This is a little girl. She's maybe 8. So it seems strange, but they keep telling him, no, it's a small town. Everyone takes care of each other. We're a community. And he hears that word throughout his whole visit to this town. We're a community. We're a community. We're a community. We're a community. And I think he can't quite track down any concrete clues. And all the alibis these people have are just kind of vague, but also they are verifiable either by cameras or by receipts or some other form of evidence. So he can't nail down these suspects, and he can't find a hard trail of clues. But the woods, I think, are calling to him. So he suspects that there's something going on in the woods, and he goes out to the woods and he tries to search for the little girl, and I think he finds a bow, a red bow that's been dropped, and
sure,
maybe he chatted with her best friend, and her best friend had talked about the bow she was wearing. So he's like, this is a clue. I found a clue. And then he goes back into town and he's trying to find someone to verify that this is the little girl's bow. But when he goes back into town, everyone is older, including the little girl's best friend. They're like, why are you back here? She was found 10 years ago. You can go talk to her. She works at the grocery store now. And then he walks into the grocery store, and sure enough, there is the general manager, also looking older, that he had interviewed and suspected of foul play years ago. And there's this girl that he had seen pictures of. He can still see the child in her adult face. And he says, is this yours? And she goes, why do you have that, you creep? And he can't even leave because his car isn't there. His ID has rotted.
Oh, no.
And I don't know where it goes from there.
That's totally fine. That was not what I was expecting. When you said everybody got older, chills. It's like, ooh, I hate that. Oh, my gosh. Wow, I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I heard your story about you standing on top of a tree as a vampire. And I'm like, maybe you have a little bit of insight into what this would look like. Because, listen, in my head, when you told that to me, I'm like, you're the horror story. You're the folklore that the people in the town
That was my dream.
About.
I wanted to be.
You're the girl in the forest standing on trees and looking down on people passing by.
In some universe.
But I love that. That was such a fun story. And then just thinking about where does he go from there? How does he leave? He doesn't have a car. He doesn't have a point of contacts that are 10 years old. Does he go back into the forest? Is there any way to reverse this?
I don't think they let him leave town.
Oh my gosh.
I think that this was, I know I told the story, but I was also making it up as I spoke. So I'm like trying to form meaning out of it like now. I think it's more of he was lured into the town as a sort of feeding the trees, because the trees probably need a soul of some sort, like they're vampire trees, right? So he was probably lured into the town and given false clues that to go to the woods to find this little girl. And he came out faster than they anticipated. And he didn't die of old age like he was supposed to in the woods.
So he's an anomaly. I see. Okay.
Sure.
Sometimes we're tempted to continue the story, but we know we could go on forever and ever.
I think, though, they get him back in the woods and that's where he dies.
Totally fair. Totally valid. Just a cog in the machine.
Yep.
I appreciate that. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I need to give you the platform to plug anything you're working on now, which is like 5, 6, 10 things, whatever you feel like needs the most attention right here, right now. Assume this is coming out sometime in August. I'll get it out eventually.
Okay. So once again, I am Cassi Mothwin. You can find me and my stuff on my website at www.cassimothwin.com. No E, just CASSI. I will probably have wrapped up Carved by the Garden, which is my solo folk horror tabletop RPG on Kickstarter by the time this goes live. But pre-orders should be available on BackerKit, and you can find links to that most likely on any of my socials, my Twitter, my Facebook, or my Instagram, wherever, as well as I'll throw a link on my website, probably on the front page too, so it's easy to find. If you want to find Tangled Blessings, you can also find links to that digitally, as well as physical prints on my website, and that's my dark academia magical school horror game that Dante and his co-hosts really enjoyed. So I would love it if you checked it out too. I also have other stuff. Go look at it too. It's all best-selling and award-winning. Thank you. Okay.
Nice flex. I appreciate that. All right. When we wrap up, this is just one episode of season 6 is about to start right after this hopefully a week after we release this episode. We'll see you then for more stories to tell and worlds to build. But as you tap into the endless imaginations of your mind and realize the potential of all the limitless stories you have yet to tell, always remember that there is one small detail that never changes by any setting anyone has ever made. And that is, your rivers are wrong. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Rivers Are Wrong. If you have ideas for topics, prompts, or you just want to share your thoughts, please reach us at yourriversarewrong@gmail.com. That's yourriversarewrong@gmail.com. Also, a big thanks to Maarten Schellekens, who created the intro and outro music for our podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening. We hope to see you at the next one. Bye.